what comes to mind? You might be thinking of old buildings, the wonders of the natural world, or the cufflinks left to you by your legendary great-granddad. The truth is, heritage can be all these things and more. Heritage is what we inherit and also choose to protect and celebrate. Determining what heritage is important enough to protect is a complex process, but it's essential work because heritage belongs to all of us. For more information about Victorian heritage and how it is protected, see the Heritage Information Pack accompanying this video. When you hear the word heritage, what comes to mind?
You're about to be subjected to another version of that video, but no, you've got me instead. Well, hello everyone. I'm Professor Philip Goad, Chair of the Heritage Council of Victoria. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I wish to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight. I'd like to also acknowledge the apology of the Minister for Planning, Sonia Kilkenny. She's been called away to a very special cabinet meeting this evening and is not able to make it, and she has sent her sincere apologies. So, the Heritage Council. For those of you that may not know, we're an independent statutory authority that makes decisions in relation to the Victorian Heritage Register. Thank you. It's like being at school. We provide advice in relation to cultural heritage protection and promote and celebrate Victoria's heritage. Today, the Victorian Heritage Register, our official list of state-significant heritage places and objects, includes around 3,000 entries, with more than 400 located within the City of Melbourne. It's the Heritage Council's vision to ensure that this cultural heritage is valued and protected, enriching the lives of current and future generations and inspiring ongoing use and sustainable adaptation. Cultural heritage plays an important role in shaping our sense of identity and place, connecting us to the past and to the diverse histories of those around us. And it's this diversity that gives Victoria and Melbourne their distinct character, a living record of who we are and how we come to be here. Before we begin, I'd like to also note, amongst the movement upstairs, that the building we meet in today was recently submitted as part of the World Heritage nomination for Workers' Assembly Halls by Australia, Denmark and Belgium. So this is a very long process, a great thing to be part of. This is the first time that Australia's been part of a transnational nomination, and it recognises these places are important because they represent the early years of the international democratic labour movement. The World Heritage Committee is expected to decide if the properties will be inscribed onto the World Heritage List in 2027. If successful, this trades hall will join 21 other Australian World Heritage sites in official recognition of its great cultural and universal importance. Now, it's a real pleasure to return tonight to the annual Heritage Address and to help close out another incredible Open House Melbourne weekend. The Heritage Council of Victoria has proudly supported Open House Melbourne, Australia's largest architectural festival, for many years. Open House helps the public discover and appreciate good design through providing access to many spaces and many heritage places across Victoria. The theme of this year's Open House Melbourne is Generous City, And tonight our speaker, historian, author and curator Robyn Annear, will explore how Melbourne's laneways are a generous hidden network traced through our city's networks. Robyn's work focuses on the story of everyday urban life, and it highlights histories which are often overlooked or forgotten. She discusses ordinary people, their peculiar historical anecdotes, Melbourne's settlement, the gold rush, and the changing face of our city, making our history feel vivid and dynamic. Robyn has written 10 books, including Bear Brass, which won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, and other titles are A City Lost and Found, Wheel and the Wreckers Melbourne, Nothing New Adrift in Melbourne, and most recently, Shutter City, Fragments of a Forgotten Melbourne. She had appeared in the acclaimed 2022 documentary, The Lost City of Melbourne. And if you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. And she currently presents stories from Trove historical newspapers in her podcast, Nothing on TV. Alongside her writing, Robyn works as a curator, and her recent exhibition, Gotcha, Concrete Prints from the McEwen's Celebrity Pavement at the Melbourne Town Hall, mirrored her other work, putting together stories from historical fragments and traces of everyday life left behind. She'll publish her new book, Lost Laneways of Melbourne, which expands upon the theme of tonight's address in November this year. Robyn estimates Melbourne once contained around 320 distinct laneways with close to 500 names, many of which have vanished from memory and maps. And these laneways are far more than shortcuts. They reflect the identity of Melbourne itself. They record our city's rapid growth, its construction, its ruthless demolition, but also its continuity, its community, its cultures and everyday life playing out just beyond the main streets. So tonight's address will highlight that heritage is woven into the everyday spaces that we walk through without a second thought. Our laneways are a reminder that connection and identity can be found in the most overlooked elements of our city, and that protecting heritage means valuing these unassuming places just as much as our landmarks. Now, this evening, there'll be an opportunity to ask Robyn questions at the end of her address, so please connect to the QR code shown on the screen, wherever it is, throughout tonight's presentation. So it's now my very great pleasure to be able to welcome to the stage Robyn Annear. Welcome, Robyn.
Thank you, Philip. That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Philip, and the Heritage Council of Victoria for inviting me to speak here tonight. Can I just say that I love the fact the Heritage Council of Victoria has kept the of, by and large, the of in their name. Should we? People are asking for me to speak more loudly. So do we need, you're turning that up? Great. I love that they've kept the of in their name, Heritage Council of Victoria, bucking the trend of State Library Victoria, and that sort of corporate streamlining. So I'm all for these prepositional speed bumps, so respect, Philip, and Heritage Council. Now, you may have seen in the promo for this event, I called myself a one-time laneway-sceptic. And I still am a sceptic, in a way, about the laneways. It seems to me the current craze for laneways, and it's not, I know, confined to Melbourne, is very much an outflow of the sort of Instagrammable or TikTokable moments of the kind of sharing, or let's be honest, oversharing, that comes from having a camera in every pocket. Plus the commodification of street art, plus the same impulses and fascination that draw people to secret, shady places that might lead who knows where. Those impulses, those fascinations, I get it, but when they run to herd behaviour, not so much. This, of course, is Hosier Lane. It was the most Instagram place in Australia in 2024. Outranking Uluru, Sydney Opera House and Pinoak Court, Vermont South, the real life Ramsay Street from Neighbours. And this perfect image here comes from Visit Victoria, the state government's visitor hub online. And unlike this one, many of the images you'll be seeing tonight are far from perfect. They include portions of old maps and documents and, worst of all, snaps I took myself. But their flaws, I'm making excuses here, but their flaws are in keeping with the imperfections, and I celebrate them, of the city itself, as well as our necessarily imperfect grasp of the past. Now, I missed a line up here at the top which said, thank you all for coming out tonight on this freezing night, and look at you standing. It must be toasty up there. People are fanning. It's not so toasty down here, believe me. So welcome to Solidarity Hall, where we are, in fact, solidaritous in our esteem for Melbourne heritage and history. So our imperfect grasp of the past. Oops, I don't know why I'm pointing there. I don't think I meant to. This is a plan. This is some of the sorts of things that I just spent hours poring over. This is surveyor Robert Russell's plan of the settlement that became Melbourne. This is the plan of how it looked kind of pre-1837, but with the later blocks overlaid. A map like this one gives us a sense of the lie of the country, how it would have looked, not just to settlers from Van Diemen's Land and Sydney, but to the people who'd known the place for generations before them. Marked on here are things like the light forest, tracts of swampy ground, the slopes of Batman's and Burial Hill, that was Flagstaff Hill then, fresh water above the falls, and the falls themselves at the foot of the soon-to-be Queen Street. Even the track that winds through the settlement gives you a sense of the curving slope that did shape it, with the ground dropping steeply away to the river in parts. This map, Robert Hoddle, 1840, early in 1840. This map includes the sort of fingerprint contour lines of the Western Hill and the slope of the Eastern Hill, coming in like a shadow encroaching on the town from the east. In thinking about how the city took shape, again, good to have this sense of the land, the slopes and so on that underlie it. I was going to say that shaped it, but the audacity also of town planning that could treat the prone outline of sleeping giant like it was a billiard table, laying down this unyielding grid of rectangles and just insisting that it be made to fit. In June 1837, the first 100 town allotments were auctioned. They were in town sections 2, 4, 12, 13 and 14. And you can see those marked out there on that early map. These allotments, the smaller constituents of Hoddle's grid, were the key to the formation of the laneway network. Over here we see in close-up one of the town sections. This was section 1, outlined by Spencer Street, Flinders, King Street and Collins, with Flinders Lane running through the middle of it. And just from their outlines, again, you can imagine how these allotments would lend themselves to the advent of lanes. Now, the larger plan we see here is deceptive in that all the streets appear to be of the same width. And that may have been Hoddle's, well, it was Hoddle's original intention. But Governor Burke, who stepped out the town with him to lay down the final plan, insisted on the inclusion of the little streets, intermediate with the great streets being 99 feet wide, interspersed with these little ones of 33, 1/3 the width. They were originally called the lanes. So those were Melbourne's original lanes, just 1/3 as wide. The idea was that on each of these long allotments, going from Little Street to Great, a single townhouse or store, hotel, bank, warehouse or whatever would face the Great Street frontage with vehicle access at the rear from the Little Street. In fact, the crossing of these Great Street footpaths, which didn't exist then, of course, but were allowed for in the street widths, the crossing of these Great Street footpaths by any carriageway was strictly forbidden. You could run a footway or a passage from your property to the Great Street, but not what we would now call a driveway. They were restricted to the little streets, which were meant to have no footpaths to be crossed, which is to say the little streets were intended only for rear access by livestock and wheeled traffic. In the beginning, they didn't even merit names, not even the derivative ones of Little Collins and so on. In December 1838, that's 18 months after these first land sales, Captain Lonsdale, Melbourne's senior government official at the time, alerted the Sydney authorities that many of the houses in the town have been built in the lanes. He meant Governor Burke's little streets. Their narrowness and lack of footpaths were meant to signal their unsuitability as streets. But with actual street frontages increasingly pricey and in short supply, these rear lane-facing portions of allotments were being sold off or let and cluttered up not just with houses but with shops, hotels and other businesses. Hoddle, for his part, regretted having caved to the governor on the narrow lanes, which he now grumbled have unfortunately become streets. But now, at the end of 1838, as Lonsdale explained, the inhabitants say they're beginning to feel an inconvenience in these little streets not having a name. In fact, he'd had trouble preventing the townsfolk from naming them themselves. He therefore proposed the lanes be officially called Flinders, Collins and Burke Lanes, with Little Flinders, etc. The Surveyor General's office in Sydney agreed to their being designated Flinders Lane, Collins Lane and Burke Lane. But for some reason, only Flinders Lane kept the lane and the others would go on to be called Little. So now a shopkeeper in Flinders Lane would have the convenience of an address. But in Sydney, the Deputy Surveyor General, Samuel Perry, warned the government at this point of a serious mischief in the making, viz. That by allowing Melbourne's lanes to develop into streets, they risked deranging the symmetry of a plan that was fully considered in the first formation of the town. If town allotments were divided into ever smaller portions, which is, he said, to be apprehended, a maze of off-street alleys and passages would inevitably follow and, said Perry, Melbourne will be ruined before it has risen to maturity. This is a plan by one Mr. Williamson from 1839, reproduced at a later date, which is why it's pretty clean looking. 4 more government land sales of allotments in most blocks south of Lonsdale Street had taken place before this map was published in September 1839. It gives us an idea of how the town was taking shape, showing the distribution of structures and colour coding them by building materials and the number of stories, which was either 1 or 2 at that point. This is a detail from that map. Green signified timber structures and pink, or really brownish colour, signified brick. And there were some actual pink ones, brighter pink, and they signified mud structures. So there's a line, let me see if I can get my little pointer here. There's a line here in section 21, allotment 4. That would be Ball Alley Lane soon. Now it's Staunton Place off Little Burke Street between Meyer and David Jones at the back. There's also a sparse line of mud huts in this one, section 5 of allotment 20. That's just uphill from the Melbourne GPO, and that would be soon Side Bottoms Lane. The footballers' Side Bottom were descendants of the Side Bottom for whom that lane was originally named. Interestingly, I mean, nothing is yet shown, or not much is yet shown across here, which is one of the first named lanes in Melbourne, McKillop Street. Still existing, of course, and we see very little happening there at this point. But what we are seeing here are the first fruits of the subdivision mania that kicked off early in 1839. So we're certainly seeing a lot of inbound traffic in these allotments. They're not just along the street fronts as planned. The government authorities in Sydney had been slow, negligently slow, it was said, to roll out sales of sufficient Melbourne town land, with the result that the population and mercantile activity, they were growing fast, and demands for allotments far outstripped supply. To exacerbate matters, since the end of 1837, these government land sales had been held in Sydney of Melbourne allotments, where they were overwhelmingly bought by speculators, even then called land sharks, rather than by bona fide settlers. Only think wrote the Melbourne settler and pioneer John Pascoe Fawkner. Only think, a person wishing to buy a plot of land to build a house upon must travel by land through the wild bush 600 miles, or he must pay a sum of £20 for his passage to Sydney and back, and waste, and this is capitalised, very Trumpian, and waste at least 2 months of his time. Early in 1839, Fawkner was complaining of the defacement of the town by the alleys and lanes due to these original allotments being subdivided into sixths and eighths. Because, of course, for access, every subdivision spawned at least one new right-of-way, the umbrella term that was for alleys, courts, passages and lanes. Fawkner had predicted that the government's doling out of allotments in miserable pittances and extravagant prices would result in a fatal, foolish frenzy, and so it turned out. It wasn't fatal, luckily. In February 1839, Fawkner's newspaper, that was the Port Phillip Patriot, ran a report headed Land Mania that told of how 2 allotments in Section 3, cut up into 12 lots, had fetched over £1,200 at auction. That's a 5,000% increase on the original price paid for those 2 allotments just 14 months earlier. That was the beginning. 3 months later, a dispatch to Hoddle, from the Surveyor General's office in Sydney, this was Samuel Perry again, sounded this note of alarm. I cannot impress too strongly the necessity for insisting upon a strict adherence to the plan of the town that has been laid out in its original form with more regularity than perhaps any other town in the colony, and will, if not deformed by the cupidity of small allotment speculators, be one of the most striking ornaments in the southern world. Across the course of 1839, it became commonplace for a right-of-way to be listed among the features of any town lot, the many town lots advertised for sale. Initially, they'd branch off the little streets, and pretty soon they were branching off one another. By the spring of 1839, the Melbourne grid was becoming so deformed by rights of way that an item in the Sydney Gazette, quoting a correspondent, may have been Fawkner, they asserted that the town, Melbourne, has already become a city of lanes overflowing with brothels and sly grog shops. This was a sale plan, an advertisement for sale of some allotments up the top end of Collins Street in August 1840. Between Flinders Lane and Collins Street, or Little Flinders Street it says here, in Collins Street, opposite the Melbourne Club now, this was a subdivision, I would say, worthy of Elon Musk, with a laneway and appendages reminiscent of a rocket or a phallus, or possibly both. Somerset Place, this Somerset Place, as it was putatively named, there were 2 others elsewhere in town. This one never came to pass. Later, a lane called Freemasons Lane would occupy roughly the same position until it was rubbed out in the 1970s for the Collins Place development. The auctioneer's advertised description of the site, which is over there, situated on the very summit of the Eastern Hill, commanding an uninterrupted view of Williamstown, the shipping lying at anchor in Hobson's Bay, Mount Macedon, etc., was pretty toned down compared to the usual fevered hyperbole, which went more like this. Standing upon allotment 5, block 15, a magnificent prospect presented itself to the eye, leaving on the mind of the beholder a feeling that could not have been excited even by a view of the far and truly famed bays of Dublin and Naples. 'Twould need the pen of some eminent writer to portray in sufficiently glowing terms its numberless advantages. This was just an allotment up the west end of Collins Street. And this prose comes to us courtesy of the auctioneer Charles Williams, who at that time was Melbourne's acknowledged master of real estate hype. The fine print on this advert finishes with an elegant lunch with cigars will be provided for gentlemen and lemonade and confectionery for ladies. These were usually held in these gigantic tents. There would also have been champagne, one of the champagne lunches that accompanied such sales, which resulted in the town being left strewn for years to come with champagne bottles, broken and otherwise. Let's see what comes next. I thought so. Any questions? Have a think about them now, and if you want to take a snap of that while it's still up there, now is your chance. I'll give you 2 seconds more. Yes, I can see there are cameras up. All right, folks, I'm moving on. What do we got here? Views looking southwest from around about the Town Hall corner. The top one is a sketch by George O'Brien capturing the town at the latter end of 1839. And below is roughly the same view from a panorama by Samuel Jackson less than 2 years later. That was in July 1841. So 1839, 1841. Comparing these two views, you get a real sense of the extent to which the grid has been filled in and beginning to be crazed by subdivisions and their attendant rights of way during this short but crucial interval. 1841 brought the inevitable crash that ended Melbourne's first land boom, after which the pace of the town's development slackened off for years. So it really was an intensive boom for 2 years that went from the beginning of 1839 through till near the end of 41. And so many of our lanes, as we will see, came out of that period, that very short period. Okay, don't expect you to read this, but this is giving you an idea. This is a snap from the electoral roll for Burke Ward of the City of Melbourne in 1842. It was actually the town of Melbourne. So this was from the list of eligible voters published ahead of the first Melbourne Town Council elections in 1842. It's a selection of the voters in the Burke Ward. The Burke Ward was the northwest quadrant of the city. Many of the lanes listed as voters' addresses were shown simply as a right-of-way out of King Street or a lane between Little Burke and Lonsdale Street, suggesting they weren't even named by the people who lived there yet. But others did have names, which were in no way official at this stage. Names like Greenwood Place, Barrabull Place, Wrights Lane, Felix Place and Sidebottoms Place. A place, generally speaking, was a dead end, also called a court, a close or an alley, while a lane went right through from one street to another, which strictly speaking, it still wasn't allowed. Like I said before, a lane in the form of a carriageway could not open onto a main street footpath. But perhaps at this early date, Wrights Lane, which we see listed here, running through from Little Burke, maybe it narrowed through to a footway where it opened onto Lonsdale Street at the other end. And Wrights Lane is now part of Hardware Lane. It lost its name when Hardware Lane came into being in the 1920s. Greenwood Place, as far as I can tell, would later become Guests Lane in the west end of the city, off Little Burke Street. And Barrabull Place, I'm pretty sure, was the forerunner of Turnbull Alley, which I think has now disappeared. Felix Place was renamed Phoenix Place before it disappeared altogether. And Sidebottoms Place, which I mentioned before, went on to be, keep count, Vinges Lane, Millers Lane and Vengeance Lane before finally settling on the name it has now, which is Racing Club Lane. It's up off Little Burke Street, just uphill from the GPO. In the council's rate books, again, no marks for being able to read these, but in the council's rate books from the period, it's very rare to see a lane or a right-of-way named. This was 1843. These were the first rate books. We find the Gippsland Ward, that's the northeast quadrant of the city. The Gippsland Ward rates assessor designated laneways wherever he came to them as being off Little Burke Street or off whatever the street was. 2 years later, 1845, we're still in Gippsland Ward, and lanes were identified as, for instance, number 2 Close or number 1 Cross Lane off Burke Street. So they were beginning to number them and order them, again giving us a sense of how many there were and trying to bring some order to them. A close was, of course, was the blind alley, whereas what they called a cross lane in the rate books went right through from street to street. And here we are, 1850, and this is in Burke Ward. Wrights Lane, which we talked about before, is both named and numbered on here by the rates assessor, lane number 19. Unlike lane number 20, which is now Niagara Lane, although it wasn't yet called that. Probably wasn't yet called anything, but what would become the Niagara Hotel and give it its name on the lane's Lonsdale Street corner was the then, at this time, the notorious Angel Inn. So who knows, maybe at that point it was called Angel Lane. Now this is not terrifically exciting, but it's a tiny little clip from one of a series of block by block plans undertaken for the City Council in 1853. And what we see here is the northern or Flinders Lane end of Highlander Lane. And some of you will know Highlander Lane right down in the river end of the city, at the west end of the city. Still some old bluestone bond stores and so on backing onto or fronting onto Highlander Lane. But this is the Flinders Lane end of that lane. And in April 1853, it was annotated as being an impassable slough, in other words, a quagmire. So it was the only place in the city that was marked this way, which when you hear what I have to tell you now will surprise you. As early as 1841, one commentator observed that in Melbourne there are on some allotments on which, according to the original scheme, of only 1 or 2 dwellings were expected to be erected, not fewer than from 20 to 30 tenements are now existing. And by the late 1840s, a looming health crisis was blamed in no small part on this barbarous system of huddling small cottages together in obscure back lanes. The editor of the Port Phillip Gazette mounted a crusade for improved sanitation in the city, writing in October 1849, "Nothing could be more prejudicial to the sanitary state of Melbourne than those numerous lanes, alleys or gullies," interesting, vulgarly termed rights of way. If cholera, fever or typhus should supervene, the mean instrument of such a calamity will be traceable to the disgraceful state in which the rights of way are allowed to remain in this otherwise well-built and opulent town. This is the end of the 1840s. Back then, Melbourne had no garbage collectors, they called them scavengers then, and no system for the disposal of night soil. Any vacant space in the back lanes was liable to become the neighbourhood midden, a dumping ground for household waste. And in an age before plastic, that waste was almost exclusively organic in nature, and so it would rot and fester on the spot. Too often, that same unloved spot would attract runoff, not just stormwater, but overflow from backyard cesspits. That's if the privy buckets weren't directly emptied there, as well as from slaughter yards, from tanneries and other noxious trades in the neighbourhood. You're getting the picture. The result was a foul soup that hit peak putrescence, of course, in the summer, but was offensive at all seasons of the year. The pockets of poisonous air, or miasmas, that hung over these backyard morasses, backlane morasses, were believed to be the chief cause of disease. Now, one such hotbed of pestilence was to be found up a narrow lane, perhaps it was only a footway, that roughly corresponded with the arm now of Block Arcade that opens onto Elizabeth Street, if you can picture this. "We really do not remember to have witnessed in any other place," said the Patriot in 1848, "such an absolute concentration of all that is loathsome and squalid." At the very spot where now stands the grand vault ceiling turning of the Block Arcade, this is what the visitor would have found. A piece of ground of perhaps 1/4 of an acre in extent, thickly studded with mean, low, dilapidated-looking dwellings. Now let him look a little to the left and he will perceive a lane, and this would be Brown Alley, now Dame Edna Place, into which nothing short of madness could induce either man or beast to venture. A little further on and his eyes will be refreshed with the sight of a piece of water wherein almost every description of decayed animal and vegetable matter is to be met with in as many different stages of decomposition. In 1848, fearing this outbreak of deadly epidemic, the City Council appointed a sanitary committee, of course, to inquire into root causes and come up with affordable means of heading off a calamity. Expert testimony was sought from the town's clergy and medical men, and they were united in the opinion that nowhere was disease likely to manifest than in the close and ill-ventilated lanes and alleys of the town. But while the back lanes ranked amongst the inflictions undermining Melbourne's naturally healthy situation and salubrious climate, the underlying issue was identified as deficient drainage, specifically the lack of subsurface drains. And it would be almost 50 years before Melbourne would adopt a proper system of sewerage. For now, though, attempts to improve even surface drainage were stymied by the lack of running water and by the same ill-formed, plugged-up back lanes that bred these miasmas. Unlike the gazetted streets, by the end of the 1840s, Melbourne's lanes were still unmade, with no surfacing, no gutters, or any attempt at formation, so like cambering or incline that would help encourage runoff. And here's the thing to know. All these lanes and alleys and rights of way, created willy-nilly, all were private, not public property. And to complicate matters, each lane was owned piecemeal by the various, often many owners whose property faced or abutted or who used that lane. By rights, the City Council had no authority over the lanes themselves. But as the Mayor said, no person could go through the city and see the condition of the courts, alleys and lanes without feeling it was a necessity to get at the root of the evil by compelling the owners of property to put and keep them in repair. So at the start of 1850, Melbourne's first Building Act came into effect, largely because of sanitation concerns. One of its stated aims was to halt the farther progress of building in narrow lanes and over time to thin out the concentration of habitations there. But hopes that it might tackle the immediate public health risk posed by the back lanes was dashed when a section of the Act addressing their drainage was struck out before the bill was ratified. These omitted clauses would have compelled owners of property and private lanes to undertake and pay for the proper formation and upkeep of those ungovernable rights of way. Now, there followed an amount of argy-bargy between the City Council and the colonial government, still in Sydney, of course, before a separate bill was passed, effective from the start of 1851 with the catchy title, An Act for Regulating the Formation, Drainage and Repair of Streets, Courts and Alleys on Private Property within the City of Melbourne, otherwise known as the Private Lanes and Alleys Act. Well, look at this. That's a fine print for you to read, but I just want to get an impression of this. Straight away, the City Council ordered a survey of all the city's rights of way. And by March 1851, just a few months after that Act came into effect, the City Inspector had identified 64 lanes that required immediate repair. Here they are, listed. They were published in the press, listed by ward and identified by locality and their block and allotment numbers, not named. The first lane listed is in Gippsland Ward, off Burke Street, north side, allotment 4 in block 24, and that was Juliet Terrace, now Liverpool Street, where the runoff from William Crossley's butchering yard had long been an aggravation to the residents. This newspaper notice also gave detailed specifications, all this other writing on this side, of the work to be undertaken, materials, incline, dimensions, including, would you believe, a footpath of not less than 3 feet wide on either side of every lane. And given that some lanes were only 8 feet wide or less, this would prove impossible to enforce. This is an abbreviated version of the complete list of Melbourne lanes, which was published in the press a few months later, August 1851. And now the order came that all of them had to be freed from obstruction, paved, flagged, macadamised, levelled, drained and sewered. In all, in this list, 290 lanes were listed, but about 40 of those were double-ups, where the same lane was counted twice, one at either end. E.g. lanes 280 and 285 on this list were both MacKillop Street, one at its Burke Street and the other at its Little Collins Street end. Now, I had always figured that Melbourne's lanes must be the product of the gold rush era, that the sudden surge in population and demand for inner city housing after 1851 had resulted in the pixelation of the otherwise hitherto unsullied grid. But this list is, for me, hard evidence for the existence of at least 250 Melbourne laneways before the gold rush even kicked off. one of the things that for a long time misled me, I think, into supposing these lanes postdated the Gold Rush were maps like this one. In fact, almost any map you like to look at. This beauty from the collection of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria dates to about 1852, so very early in the Gold Rush era, and there's hardly a sign of a lane on it. Up here in Burke Ward, you've got what may be Greenwood Lane, Greenwood Place. You've got Bank Place here opposite Market Street, where it still is, of course. There's Laneway up next to the Eastern Market, at the top end of Burke Street, which corresponds with the later Eastern Arcade. And there's a couple more down in Lonsdale Ward, down at this end of town. But you wouldn't say by any means this depicts a city of lanes, certainly not 250 of them. Now, that City Council directive ordering the formation and repair of the lanes was dated, remember, August 1851, and that was just weeks after the discovery of gold. As Melbourne's working population decamped to their diggings, the cost of labour and materials just skyrocketed, and it wouldn't come down for about a decade. So the intention of the City Council was that each lane's owners would band together and get the necessary works done and pay for them. What actually happened in nearly every case was the owners relied on the City Council to facilitate the works and then, and good luck with that, to extract payment from each property owner proportionate to their stake in the lane. The breakdown of costs and payments for the construction of each lane was recorded in what was called a flagging allotments register. And the register for the years 1852 to 55 shows that the cost of making a lane to the standards of the Lanes and Alleys Act could run to as much as £1,000, in some cases putting each property owner's share at more than 100, sometimes several £100. And these were astronomical sums in those times. And people couldn't, or at least didn't, always pay, which left the council deeply out of pocket. As work on each laneway was completed and paid for, the City Council would officially recognise the lane by naming it, not coming up with the names themselves, which was impressive, but just formalising those names by which the lanes were already known. This was the first batch of names approved by the City Council in August 1853. In Lonsdale Ward, there was Lambeth Place, which is now Fulham Place off Flinders Lane, along with Ryrie Lane, Foxton Lane and Barrett's Alley. In Gippsland Ward, Juliet Terrace again, Romeo Lane, that's Liverpool and Crossley Streets, Haywood Lane and Drury Lane, both still there. And in Burke Ward, Grimes Alley, later called Burke Place, Red Lion Alley, again named after a hotel, and is now Merritt's Place, and Uniacke Alley, still to be found there. And in Latrobe Ward, of the lanes listed here, only Masons, Scott, Rainbow and Howie Lanes have kept the same names. So Rainbow Lane, which is well known by the Melbourne Town Hall there, was among the first lanes in existence and to be named. This is Celestial Avenue, which sounds fairly grand, off Little Burke Street, really in the heart of Melbourne's Chinatown. It was originally called, well, you'll find out in a moment. This is a page from the flagging allotments register, exciting document that it is, dated May 1855. It shows the costs of forming lane number 38 in Gippsland Ward. The occupants of 2 properties in the laneway are listed as, in brackets, Chinese. And this is one of the earliest official records I've seen of the presence of immigrants from China in this part of Little Burke Street recorded. In August 1855, the council would name the previously unnamed lane number 38 Celestial Alley, not Avenue at that stage. It had to grow into that. Oops. This is a lane of Gippsland Ward drawn inside the front cover of the rates book for 1856 by the man, presumably, who walked around assessing the properties in that ward. And it shows the location, though not the name, of every laneway in the northeast quadrant of the city. And it also supplies down the bottom here a key to the location of public houses in the ward, as well as schools and churches. So it's a real find, because while most of them aren't named, the numbers on their corners correspond with the rates book itself, so you're able to figure out who was living there. Often their name will be the one that's attached later attached to the lane. This was Purcell's most complete, popular and mercantile map of Melbourne, 1854, by Frederick Purcell. He was a newcomer himself, and his map was intended for newcomers. He was a Frenchman who'd arrived in Melbourne via California in 1852, part of the great influx of international gold seekers. And while by no means comprehensive, this map at least gives us a sense of the city's laniness. Here's a close-up on Gippsland Ward, up in the northeast corner of the city, and we see I've circled there Purcell's what he called his English, French and German Information and Labour Agency Office. Very, very prolix, these Victorians, at 135 Little Bourke Street, or actually, to be specific, in number 8 right of way, which is marked number 8 right of way on the map. And it would be soon named Brown's Lane and now renamed Cohen Place. I think we've almost touched on all the Brown's Lanes that were in the city, and you see why some of them, at least, have been renamed. Some lanes were already shown up here in the little lawn block, right up in the corner of the city, and there's also somewhere up there, no, I think I've cut it off. Oh no, there they are. I think there's some tents up here. These tents, these camping places were shown throughout the city, vacant areas where you could chuck up a tent if you couldn't find another place to live in those crowded times. I'm going to move on. This was from the famous, well, I think it's famous, the Bibbs, the amazing Bibbs map from a Public Records Office. This shows one city block, section number 12, circa 1855. It's bounded at the top by Bourke Street, the mall, as we would know it now, then Elizabeth Street, Collins Street, Swanson Street, and of course running through the middle, Little Collins Street. This has always been amongst the most laneway-intensive parts of Melbourne. In the 1850s, it boasted 13 laneways, and it still has 12. That's if you count Royal Arcade and the Collins Arcade, both of which started off life as laneways. This is the view from the top of Parliament House in 1858, looking west down Bourke Street. We'll move in closer, and you can see, whoop, have I moved in closer? I have not. Moving closer, you can see those two shafts of light cutting across the footpath there. These denote Juliet Terrace and Romeo Lane. And the building between those two lanes is the same one that's still there today. And here it comes. And that's it. That's the Crossley buildings, number 54 to 62 Bourke Street, which houses the paperback bookshop and formerly on the corner here, the job warehouse. It was built in 1848 for William Crossley, whom I mentioned earlier, the butcher with the noxious backyard. Crossley Street, of course, named after him. Construction on the site, as you can see, is currently underway, watched diligently, I'm sure, by Heritage Victoria. This was Cleves, well, it still is, Cleves Bonded Stores in Lonsdale Street West near King Street. This was in 1861. Two of the German-born Cleve brothers are standing here in the doorway, possibly, I think, Daniel and Sally. They're on the steps, accoutred by various members of their workforce. Again, it's a building, this one at 573 Lonsdale Street, which survives today. Alongside Cleves warehouse in the photo is, or actually it's between two Cleves warehouses, there's another just out of frame, was a working laneway, Market Alley as it was then, now called Brown Alley. These browns, they were everywhere. Possibly it was the same brown. Here we see Little Lonsdale Street, Little Lon, right at the eastern end in 1874, which would more or less have been its heyday as far as population and goings on. Let's zoom in and we'll get more of a sense of, it was hard to capture people, of course, in these images. You had to stand still for, probably only a number of seconds, but people still found it difficult. So it's hard to capture them, but there are quite a few pieces, quite populated for street shot of its time. So you get a sense, anyway, of the number of laneways branching off this portion of Little Lonsdale Street. Along the left-hand side, you can make out Griffin Alley, Castleton Place, Gorman Alley, and Little Leichhardt Street. And there's a couple of men and a boy, I think, standing here. I think there might only be one boy. It's hard to tell if it's one boy who's moved or three that stood still. They're standing at what was then the corner of Whelan's Lane, which is now Castleton Place. And visible on the right-hand side here is, where is it? Is Finn Place. I'm just trying to find, there's a sign that says Finn Place somewhere there. Oh, it's just there, there's a sign, which in the original you can see above the boy with the see-through trousers. Again, because he moved. They're so curious. Okay, what else have we got? We've got, this was Coates Lane West, about 1875. That's right at the top end of Little Collins Street. And it's no longer there. Coates Lane East is still there, so it's lucky they had a spare. This was Coates Lane West. Don't know why they didn't have two separate names. It was curious, but they've collected together a reasonable assortment of neighbours for this shot. There's a boy at the end with a cricket bat, I think, and you know, people in aprons and you know, just people going about their business. But I think they've been called out to get in the shot. Charles Nettleton was the photographer, and he was well accustomed to the art of peopling street shots. The engraver John Shirlow produced a series of laneway views between the 1890s and the 1920s. He seems to have been one of the first to have depicted the lanes as picturesque. Here are a few of Shirlow's scenes. We've got Lush Lane or Ramsden Place, not sure which, with Scott's Church spire in the background. That's in 1896. We've got Bullen's Lane, 1909, from the other direction with Scott's Church in the background. We've got Pender Place next with the Wesley Church behind in 1919. Latrobe Place with the Victoria Coffee Palace, now the Victoria Hotel, rising up behind. And Craig's Lane, or now the Causeway, in 1919 with the then brand new Myer store across the other side of Burke Street Mall. So you can see there was a definite formula to the depiction of these to make the most of their narrowness and picturesqueness. There's a later series produced in around 1990, I think, in the State Library of Victoria, which is even more extensive. Here's a mercantile map of Melbourne showing the location of city businesses in 1907. On this map, laneways, all the laneways are clearly shown and labelled, some of them misspelled. Here's a detail from that map. We see Little Lon depicted here in 1907. There were 15 laneways there in this block, of which fewer than a handful have survived. All those in the northern half of this block. So that would be Union, Sherwood, Providence, Merritts, Cumberland, McGrath, later named Burton, and Finn Lane, all were wiped away by the early 1960s to make way for the landmark Commonwealth Centre building, disparagingly known as the Green Latrine. And here, in preparation for these mass demolitions, photographs were taken by the relevant Commonwealth Government Department. Here was Finn Place, already in the process of demolition in the early 1950s. Here's McCormick Place at the same date. On the other, and there's some graffiti over here, and you probably can't read it, but it says "Vote No for Freedom," which seems rather contradictory. But I believe it probably referred to the 1951 referendum that proposed banning the Communist Party, and the no vote just squeaked it in. We can see the Royal Society building in the background there. And here's a view from that same period of Castleton Place on the other side of Little Lonsdale Street. Now, this row of 6 cottages, just one was left standing, which you can still see today. Castleton Place in its truncated form is one of just 3 little long lanes that still kind of exist. There's also Gorman Alley and a portion of Little Leichhardt Street, but not called that. It's been reconfigured as part of Madame Brussels Lane. From that 1907 map of the city, here's a portion of Little Collins Street between Russell and Exhibition Streets. You can see the Eastern Market here and the Eastern Arcade, which fronted Burke Street on the future site of the Southern Cross Hotel. It's now Southern Cross Tower. And among the laneways running off Little Collins Street, the rear of the market was Gun Alley. Gun Alley had its name recognised by the City Council as far back as 1855, but it would have had negligible name recognition more broadly until 1921, when the body of Alma Turschke, age 11, was found there. This was the notorious Gun Alley murder. This photo from the Weekly Times had an X marking the spot where the body was found and was captioned, "Crowds of people have visited the scene." But within 20 years, Gun Alley of sinister memory, as one of the newspapers said at the time, would be eradicated, crossed off the map and built over by a car showroom. In 2021, that's exactly 100 years after the murder, Gun Alley was inadvertently, I would expect, resurrected as Benson Walk, hyped by the developers on Instagram as enabling pedestrian connectivity through the new high-end retail late-night bar hopping part of 80 Collins Street precinct. Sounds great, make mine a Negroni. All that's missing is the speakeasy called Alma's and perhaps an X to mark the spot. Among the lanes, she loses her spot, among the lanes officially named by the City Council back in 1853 was Shamrock Alley, which is now Lang's Lane, up the western end of Burke Street. Here on that Bibbs map from around 1855, you can see how in the manner of Melbourne's original laneways, that's little Burke Street there, this is Burke Street here, and here is what was then Shamrock Place, and you can see in the manner of those original lanes, it narrowed at its main street end to a footway opening. 170 years later, it's still exactly that shape. And it's skinny Burke Street end, it's maybe the narrowest laneway in the city. Its opening is less than a metre wide. So it's a real fossil, a town planning fossil, that one. The buildings either side of it, so here's the entry of the laneway now as we see it from Burke Street, and then this shot here shows how the buildings either side, including the Unity Hall built for the Victorian Railways Union, and it's now the Alto Hotel, how they have a weird bend in the many-storey wall, and that's been created to accommodate the shape of the lane, which has endured. People are exceptionally well behaved in this lane. They walk and they always keep to the side, to the correct side. It's just, you know, it does the heart good to travel up. And of course, its history as Shamrock Alley is a whole thing, and the fact that it's no longer Shamrock Alley, you know, there's a whole story in that. Used to back on to the infectious diseases hospital. There were tuberculosis outbreaks and smallpox, you name it. This is a mid-20th century map of Melbourne, street directory map of Melbourne, which pretty much shows all the laneways that there were to know back then. Quite a few have gone since then, so this is kind of peak laneway. With the exception of Geelong, which was likewise fraught with lanes in its formative era, no other Australian city was subject to or needed a mechanism like Melbourne's Private Lanes and Alleys Act. Other cities had lanes for sure, but none had so many or was so much defined by them. By a confluence of conditions, flawed urban planning, an absentee government, hasty growth and naked greed, before Melbourne was a decade old, the lanes were as integral as Hoddle's grid to the shape and navigability of the place. Those monolithic blocks of the grid, blocks was a good name for them because they're impermeable main street frontages stretching 200 metres along the east-west streets blocked, or at least stymied, north-south movement through the city. So it's no accident that nearly all Melbourne's lanes, of course, run north-south to facilitate that movement. While they didn't originate as an antidote to Hoddle's grid, that has been their effect. Without them, Melbourne was bound to be a constipated and thwartsome city. Imagine always having to take the long way round. The lanes aerated the city, they opened it up. Even the blind alleys, in my view, count as a valued adjunct to the grid. Sometimes a dead end is just what you need. I mean, not everything has to lead somewhere. And while it would be wrong to ascribe a democratising, or you could say generous, impulse to the lane's creation, they've no doubt had that effect, letting people in and through, making room for more to live and work, and putting humble or at least unsanctioned names on the map. What's more, almost from the start, these pokey rights of way undermined the surveillability of the grid's gun barrel streets as they were laid out. And at every stage of Melbourne's early development, the authorities bowed to the lane's lead, acknowledging not just their legitimacy, but just how intrinsic to the city they were and still are. A city of lanes. The lanes are Melbourne as much as anything is. Thank you. Tanya.
Thank you, Robyn. So now we have some questions. We've popped the QR code up here again for you, for those of you who missed it before, but it's right there. And we've already got some questions, so we can ask them. I am going to start with, I've lost it. No, I've got it already. Oh, no, there's more already. Quite a poetic one, I think, following on from your lead, but obviously I didn't write this. If you could follow the thread of a giant red woolen ball through Melbourne in any era, what era would that be and why?
Wow, a giant thread of red ball. That is a ball of red thread. Red as well. Interesting. Look, it would be. I think the 1890s. I think Melbourne was on the downers then, and I would find that interesting. It was out. It had lost its premier position as Australia's chief metropolis, I think, in the Depression of the early 1890s. Sydney had taken the sceptre. And I'd just like to see Melbourne making what it could of itself as it sort of entered a more shadowy time. It was also, of course, the time of the thing I really want to visit, red ball of thread or not, which is Coles Book Arcade. And I'd love to be there to just spend hours, as one was encouraged to do. Spend as much time as you like, no need to buy. That sounded like my sort of shop. So any time that I could go to Coles Book Arcade would be great, but the 1890s to me is an era of dark fascination.
I can see you right there. And in crisis, there is opportunity. So
exactly.
That's kind of an interesting period to pick. What kind of changes are being made to our lanes now, and what kind of changes do you think will happen in the future?
More of our lanes are being arcadeised. So a developer will purchase the land and then sometimes make a cross lane, as they called it, going from one end of the block to the other, out of what may formerly have been just a place or a court or an alley. So you could say, and I would in some cases even say that that's a good thing, but it does take away for me the spirit of those lanes themselves by putting them indoors and just making them shop windows, essentially, and cafe covered places to have a cup of coffee. Yes, it detracts from the spirit of the lanes, and particularly when running that lane through as an arcade, going from one end of the block to the other, obviously to promote people coming in to shop. often in the process, another lane or alley will be wiped off the map. That'll be kind of the deal. We'll make a big deal out of this one and we'll improve this laneway, but it'll cost that one. And so I'm really sorry to see any parts of you can tell, I think the lanes are one of the most important heritage features that Melbourne has. I think that about streets and places that have names in general. But yeah, so I'm in two minds. Although I've seen some terrific developments. I quite like Timothy Lane, which I love just as a lane anyway, because it's a lane that was named after someone whose name was Timothy Lane. And I do think we missed the opportunity with Don Lane. I would have loved to have seen that, but I think that ship has sailed. So you know, it can add something, but I just have reservations about the arcadeising of laneways, which is a growing trend.
So a little on theme, I think I'm going to ask a question. And because I've got the microphone, I think that's my prerogative. A little bit maybe also from an architectural kind of perspective. So the kind of lanes at the QVM development, how do you feel about them?
I mean, they're not, I don't, the lanes at where the Queen Victoria Hospital used to be, yeah, that's okay, that were created in the very early 2000s. I mean, to me, they're not real lanes. They're just feed-ins for the shopping plaza and, you know, event space. But at the time, I developed a whole prehistory for those lanes, and I said, there's nothing new about these lanes. They were always there, and for each one of them, I created a history of what it was used for as part of the hospital, and how it was. Well, we know how they were named. They all were named by the QV people. After aspects of the hospital and figures from the hospital. But I had a particular bee in my bonnet about QV because at the time of that development, I remember the buildings had been flattened. Thank you, Will, on the record. The buildings had been flattened, and the buildings went up, creating an incredible wind tunnel, I have to tell you, as someone who spent a lot of time at the State Library of Victoria. But I remember the developer being interviewed by The Age, I think, on site, just not long before that development opened for business. And they said, so tell us about what was here before. And he said, there was nothing here before. It was just a big hole. And so I just thought, this is the difference between people who are developers and people who have a different connection with the place, that it really is a way of seeing. And that was why I was determined, you know, to lend some really undeserved history to those bogus laneways.
Well, I think we all have a better connection to our Melbourne's laneways after hearing you speak this evening. I am just going to actually, there's lots of good ones, but I just want to go on from maybe your Coles bookstore story. Somebody here is just curious to know a little bit more about Coles, and potentially you could describe that and give us an understanding of what it is for the people who don't know.
Coles Book Arcade was, it was a shop. He called it an arcade. You could certainly walk through, and we're encouraged to walk through, as you are with any arcade, from Bourke Street to Little Bourke Street. It was facing onto what's now the mall. And he actually bought property in Collins Street, facing onto Collins Street, more Coles Bookshop. He had a printing works down the laneway, Howie Place, that ran from Collins Street to Little Collins at the back of Coles Book Arcade. And so he kind of took over Howie Place. He's put a glass roof over it, which you can still see, a quite ornate and ornamental glass roof. And he used to plaster the walls of the buildings either side with pages from the illustrated newspapers and so on, because he was such a proponent of reading at every opportunity. And so he encouraged people to linger in this laneway beside his printing works and between the two arms of his bookshop. So Coles Book Arcade didn't just sell books, it sold novelties of all sorts. It sold knickknacks, had a whole floor of knickknacks, or fancy goods, as they called them then, which were Mrs. Cole's particular thing. He had a menagerie with monkeys, because he believed there was real kinship between not just all humans. He believed in the great big melting pot, Mr. Cole, but he even believed, he extended the hand of that to monkeys, and he believed he could establish some communication with monkeys. And so he had monkeys in a menagerie. He had a huge music box and all kinds of things you could put a penny in and get some thrill from. But the main thing was his signs, as I said, that were posted all about the place, along with comfy chairs, saying, read as long as you want, no one is obliged to buy. So, you know, respect Mr. Cole.
I think I want to go back there now with you.
You would love it.
I think everybody in this room, literally from the questions and the thumbs up on the questions, wants to know what your favourite lane is or story of a lane and why.
Oh, man.
Always
I mean, you
can
can tell I love Lang's Lane, the former Shamrock Place. As I say, that was a place of squalor and opportunity and disease and you name it. But another lane I really love, and I think it was mentioned, thank you, Philip, earlier, that I've got a book coming out in November called Lost Laneways of Melbourne, and it focuses a lot on the laneways that are no more, or at least have shifted shape or name. But one of my favourite was one of those early ones we saw listed in that very original voters' roll, which was called Felix Place. There were actually 2 Felix Place at that stage. You know, it's just mind-boggling. You think they could have come up with more names. But Felix, of course, Port Phillip district was also known as Australia Felix, the Happy Land. And so this is what the Felix related to. But this Felix Place, it's so mysterious to me. It is no more. It's runs between Little Burke Street and Lonsdale Street, sort of behind, if anybody knows Synagogue Place, former Synagogue Place, now Little Queen Street. The sign actually says Little Queen Street, formerly Synagogue Place, the only street sign that recognises a previous identity of the laneway. So up at the back of, at the back of the Supreme Court, behind the domed library, this side of the domed library. So it was there, and it's now been taken over as part of the extended Supreme Court precinct, I guess. It was taken over in the late 19th century. But in between, it started off as the toniest part of town. It was on the outskirts. It was right up near Lonsdale Street, which was, you know, looking out to, you know, Macedon or whatever they were saying. It was the airiest and most healthful part of town, and the flash people lived there to begin with. But as invariably happened, especially where there was a laneway involved, the tone of the place went steeply downhill as the decades passed, and it was just so seedy. But there was still a component of fine living up there, facing onto Lonsdale Street, and just the clashes between the classes and the characters there just lend the place such a flavour to me. I feature it in the book, and it was just such fun, and the people really come out of the stories of the lane. You know, yeah.
I feel like we're going to have you back again when the book comes out. How does everybody feel about that?
It's such an awesome story. It's such an awesome story, Tanya. I cannot tell you. And of course, you can tell how much I love all this spatial stuff of getting into the maps and going, and then cross-referencing with it's just fantastic. Just being able to figure out what all those original laneways were and place them on the map today.
It's like a little bit of detective work.
Yeah,
it's
just
beautiful.
Brilliant.
It's amazing. Okay, this one's a tricky one, but I quite like it. What urban planning trends currently frowned upon have the most potential to eventually be appreciated by the public, like the laneways have become? That's a
good
hard
grief.
one. Currently frowned upon.
I mean, when I think about architectural trends that are frowned upon, the main one that comes to mind for me is facadism. And I'm actually a big fan of facadism because I am a Melbourne town walker, and at street level, you would much prefer to be having even the hollow, just the front of an old and beloved building than of whatever new bit of glass might go. And it doesn't matter if they promise they're going to put a plaza out the front and there'll be grass and seats for it. It doesn't last more than 20 years and then, you know, they just extend. So I'm kind of a fan of facadism because I think it keeps things real at street level. So that's why I like it. But I know it's very frowned upon. But as for other trends, I don't know. I probably don't even know what these town planning trends are, but I'd be interested to hear if anybody wants to, you know, contact me. You'll find me online and I'd love to hear what these are. See if I do frown on them.
Okay, you heard it here first. Very controversial on the facadism, I especially
I
imagine
know,
in
I
this
heard
crowd.
those.
Oh. Woo. Anyway, okay, we've got one about Hosier Lane. Why Hosier Lane particularly? Why did it become the popular one?
I don't know. There's got to be a reason for this. I mean, there were eating places sort of popped up there, and maybe one thing led to another. But so that was an interesting, slightly arty, crafty part of Melbourne. That little part of Flinders Lane and so on. Certainly some eateries came in there. So I just don't know. I mean, it's not that. I remember when it was just, you know, just a lane. You know, you see photos of it from the 80s, I think, and it was just a nothing. So yeah, interesting. Don't know why. But it is. It's a sweet lane because it's got the hill, and that's one great thing about lanes is because they're such a narrow aperture. You really do get a real sense of the rises and falls of the city better than you do in the wide streets, I think. So Hosier Lane is a great example of that. It's the hill rising up, the slope rising up from the river. So it's, you know, it's kind of sweet. I mean, but Hosier Lane's got great history. There used to be a slightly rebellious newspaper office there, and there was big industrial action happened there in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was, you know, a pretty red hot place. So maybe, you know, echoes of things rise to the surface and strike people's interest, I think, in ways you wouldn't expect.
It's hard to tell about the chemistry of the city, isn't it, really?
It is. It's very hard to tell.
Oh, this is an interesting one. Of the lanes that remain, are many still private?
Some, yes. So I had quite a bit to do with the City of Melbourne's spatial, I can't remember what it's called, spatial something department. I mean, I can't even figure out what this spatial means, but it's kind of where the surveyors and stuff hang out while I was doing this, and was privy to some of their terrific spreadsheets and things that show which lanes are private and which are public. And I was surprised at how many private lanes there still are, and some of them are still gated because originally quite a few of the private lanes were gated. And there are still some that are, but I mean, mainly they're gated for the purpose of car parking and so, well, they always were, I guess, parking of some sort. But yeah, there's still quite a number, but I think more and more of them are becoming even what they call public highways, which is a category of something which makes them kind of harder to disappear. I think is the thing. If they're accepted into that category of being, it makes it harder to wipe them off the map in the process of development. So I think, you know, that's something that's been happening increasingly since the 1990s. I think is trying to rust the laneways onto the map of Melbourne so they're not so easily disregarded.
There is something about the fine grain of the city that the lanes add to, isn't there? And this question here, which is maybe moving a little bit on from lanes, but we'll see where we go with this one. Was there a specific push or movement to remove residential housing from the CBD area in a particular time, given there was little left by the 1950s?
Yeah, I mean, there were still quite a few cottages in, say, Little Collins Street, up the eastern end of Little Collins Street, up until the 1940s and so on. But for so much inner city, what inner city residential there was left really was rolled away with the Second World War, and of course with the slum clearances that came from the 1930s onwards through the 1950s and to the 1960s. So all these little houses were just like, I mean, it was a continuation of what we saw proposed in the Building Act of 1850, that the housing in the back alley should be thinned out. But those little cottages remained. There were still some of them in, as I say, Little Collins Street. There was a pair of tiny bluestone cottages in Exhibition Street, right down near Flinders Street, that in 1935 were voted or were deemed the oldest houses in central Melbourne. And 2 years later, not 2 years, 7 years later, they were demolished to make way for a nothing sort of shoe factory or something. So, you know, it's fascinating to see how inner city housing was totally wiped off the map. It's like no one wants to live in the city, no one should live in the city. Of course, we had big buildings, like I documented in my Wheel and the Wrecker book, big banking chambers and commercial chambers and other sorts of inner city buildings built to last forever that were pulled down because no good payable use could be found for them. And of course, leave them standing another 30 years and people would have been falling over themselves to have lived in those buildings in apartments. But it's just, they just fell in that crack of inner city living was not the thing.
Okay, I'm going to go to this last one because it's kind of funny. And then it is the last one. And I think it's maybe more of a comment, but you could turn it into a question if you want.
Okay.
It says, what was Hoddle expecting? Endless rows of mansions. Do we know?
Well, I think so. I think, yeah, the idea was that this was pretty much, Melbourne was just going to be a service town for the outlying pastoral districts. So the squatters would have a townhouse. And of course, the big banks and hotels and bond stores and other kinds of businesses that would serve the pastoral industry. But that was how it was envisaged, that this was just going to be another outlying town in the New South Wales colony. And there were many of them whose planning was being done at the same time, which didn't grow into towns like Melbourne, which were just towns serving outlying pastoral districts. And that was what this one was thought of as. But yeah, it was, if you knew the people who were there, it was never going to go that way, particularly because they were these hungry, ambitious Vandemonians, people from Van Diemen's Land who just wanted to make a mark on. I mean, I'm thinking particularly obviously of John Pascoe Faulkner, but there were many like him, lesser versions of him, who, you know, were determined to make a place of this. And when you see the spirit of those people, apart from whatever good or bad luck happened to Melbourne, that was what meant this was never just going to be that.
Well, I can definitely say we can be thankful for the people who embrace the messiness. I quite like that. I can definitely deal with that. Thank you, Robyn, for that incredible presentation. It was absolutely joyful. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Might need another glass of this.
No, that's great.
Well, oops, hang on, I almost dropped the iPad. That's not going to be great. So, thank you once again to Robyn. I'd also like to thank Professor Philip Goad and the Heritage Council of Victoria, with whom we present the Heritage Address every year. With the Heritage Council, they've been with us since we started, since 2008, in one form or another, and we hope they're here for many more years to come. Open House Melbourne weekend celebrates the role great design plays in our city and shows people how design can make a difference to the way we live. And this year's weekend festival has really been something special. We have been bursting at the seams everywhere, and I think you can all attest to that tonight. So thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it, and for making this room warmer, because it's usually freezing cold in here, and I'm so sorry it's a bit toasty now. We don't know the numbers for the weekend yet. They are coming in, but everywhere we went, we had these wonderful happy volleys. We had passionate collaborators and excited punters. There were well over 10,000 people through Government House, with people lining up down the driveway and partway around the tan. And these are kind of numbers that we have not seen since COVID, and a little unexpected this year. But thank you all for turning up. And now I have so many thanks, because unfortunately our 2026 weekend is sadly at a close. So I'd like to thank all of the people who make the Open House Melbourne weekend such a huge success. We're a community organisation and we run on the smell of an oily rag, so let's be honest. Funding makes things happen and ensures we're here for years to come. Our partners and our sponsors, who are an integral part of our community and share in our mission to inspire better design outcomes, broaden public access to knowledge, and support a more inclusive and sustainable future for our city, I'd like to thank you. I'd particularly like to thank major partners, the City of Melbourne, Creative Victoria, Studio Pain and eFront, who help us every year to bring our weekend to life. To the small but mighty Open House team, Piera, Katie, Vader and Nikki, thank you. On the weekend we pass like ships in the night, but we are a very well-oiled machine. And everywhere I go, the volleys and collaborators tell me about how wonderful you all are. Not that I really need to be told, I already know. To the board and particularly to Sam Redston, who definitely goes above and beyond. Thank you, Sam. The building and volunteer councils, our advisors and ambassador, thank you, thank you, thank you. To our collaborators and almost 500 volunteers who generously give their time, thank you. We could not do this without you. And to our audience who are curious and thoughtful and passionate about all things great design and about this wonderful city of ours, thank you. At Open House Melbourne, we talk a lot about how our program brings people together and how it connects people to place. And at its heart, this is what this year's theme, Generous City, really brought home. A generous city gives more than it takes and it shares what it has. And our festival is a testament to this. It takes over 2,000 people to deliver the weekend. They throw open their doors, they give their time, and together with our audience, they are its heart and soul. This year, the festival was a celebration of people coming together around a shared love of the architectural and built heritage of our city. At a time when we're thinking deeply about social cohesion, we need more spaces like this one, more places where we feel comfortable asking questions and sharing knowledge. I love hearing the questions people are asked when they open their doors. Yesterday, somebody said to me, I love the difficult questions because I know that they are being asked from a place of care. And it's true. Our community cares deeply about the city. They love to learn about its past. They are invested in its present and optimistic about shaping its future. It lifts me up to see how much people give to our program and the joy that they take from it. So a final thanks to you all, Open House's wonderful community. I can't wait to see you all again here next year to celebrate our 20th festival. Thank you.